Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. Before we get to today's exciting show with my esteemed and absolutely delightful guest, John Logan, I just want to thank everyone who's been supportive of the podcast. This show's been going strong for almost 3 years now, believe it or not. In May, it'll be 3 years. And that's largely thanks to you, the listeners of this show. So thank you for continuing to support the podcast and listen to it. I've received so many nice comments, messages, tags on social media, shout outs in monster magazines, and very thoughtful donations as well. Speaking of, I want to thank those who have donated to the podcast through Buy Me a Coffee, and via other means as well. I'll include a link in the show notes if you'd like to donate. No pressure, of course. And absolutely thank you to all of those who have contributed, including several anonymous donors. So you know who you are, and thank you. Ted M., Paige, Dana, Christian, Jennifer, Guy, Lisa, Scott and Michael, Gay, David, Dawn, Avecchia, Mark, and my guest today, John Logan. Thank you so much for all of your support of the podcast. It's really appreciated. That does help to defray the costs of podcast hosting, of the editing software that I use. I might even be able to start doing a little advertising even outside of the internet and social media. Speaking of, you can find me on social media, on Instagram at PennyDreadful1313. I'm also on Facebook, Penny Dreadful. If you just type that in, you'll find me. I'm the one wearing the witch hat. And I am also on Twitter, well, I guess X now, Danielle13Penny. I don't know how much longer I'm going to keep that Twitter account. I'll be honest with you. But I am there for the time being anyway. As you can tell, I'm a bit stuffy. I am getting over COVID. I finally got COVID. I had not gotten it up until now, and it caught up with me just in time for opening weekend of Clue in the Falmouth Theater Guild. We did opening night, started to feel sniffly by the end of the night, achy. Did the COVID test the next day. I was positive. A couple other cast members were positive too. A couple of crew members were positive, so they had to postpone the show, reschedule it, but it is coming up again. By the time this goes up, it should be this weekend, actually, that we'll be back in action. So that would be Friday, February 9th. If we're going back up, 7:30. It's a great show. I mean, just judging by opening weekend, the show went so well. The audience was fantastic. The show went well. The cast, I had such a great time at the rehearsals for this show because every night was like comedy night. They were just on point. We were just cracking each other up, and they were especially cracking me up because they're just great. The director was great. The set looks amazing, very Edward Gorey inspired set. So if you're in the area, please come see Clue at the Highfield Summer Theater out in Falmouth, Massachusetts, out in the Cape. We have a show this weekend. On the 9th, we have a show. We have two shows on the 10th at 2 p.m. and 7:30, and then we have a matinee on Sunday the 11th, and then we're back again on Friday the 16th. We have 3 shows that weekend, and we close on the 18th, and I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to get tickets. If you do, stick around after the show. There's like a little tent area there. I'll come out. Please come over and say hi, introduce yourself. If you listen to the podcast, let me know. I would love to meet you. And speaking of the podcast, I am thrilled and excited to get to today's show featuring the marvelous John Logan. I had so much fun chatting with John, and I can't wait for you to hear this episode, so let's get to it.
Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead.
This episode contains spoilers for both Dark Shadows and Showtime's Penny Dreadful.
Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful. And he's Penny Dreadful too. What? What's happening? Well, I am ecstatic. Ecstatic, I tell you, to be joined by John Logan, the one and only John Logan, playwright and screenwriter extraordinaire. John received the Tony Award for his play Red and wrote the book for Moulin Rouge, which received the Tony Award for Best Musical. He is the author of more than a dozen other plays, including Peter and Alice, I'll Eat You Last, A Chat with Sue Mengers, and Never the Sinner. As a screenwriter, he has been nominated for the Oscar 3 times and has received Golden Globe, BAFTA, WGA, and Edgar Awards. His film work includes Skyfall, Gladiator, The Aviator, Sweeney Todd, Hugo, Rango, Alien, Covenant, Spectre, Genius, Coriolanus, The Last Samurai, Star Trek Nemesis, They, Them, and Any Given Sunday. He created the television series Penny Dreadful for Showtime. John also happens to be a passionate longtime Dark Shadows fan. So today, the creator of Showtime's Penny Dreadful is going to have a conversation with the horror hostess Penny Dreadful about Dark Shadows, a television show which shares many similarities to the original 19th century Penny Dreadfuls. It's all come full circle, John. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh
After stalking you the way I did, to
oh
say
my
like, oh, let's talk, let's talk.
Are you kidding me? Oh my goodness. I was blown away when I saw on the thank you, by the way, for your patronage of the podcast. And I saw in the buy because I saw in the buy me a coffee, I saw your name there and you just made a comment. I said, really? What? No way. So, I'm so excited to have you here. And I was talking to you right before we started, but when I watched Penny Dreadful on Showtime and enjoyed it a lot. And as I was watching, I said, wow, he must be a Dark Shadows fan. He must be a dark, because I caught a lot of just the echoes of Collinwood were in there, and even one of the characters is named Angelique. Even so, I was like, well, there must be a Dark Shadows connection here. So I'm really happy to hear that that is the case.
It could not be more the case. I will say that I was sort of raised with the holy trinity of Dark Shadows, Star Trek, and Planet of the Apes. And I was a
Awesome.
monster. Yeah, I was a monster kid from the time I can remember, opening my eyes. So I ran home from school. It was San Pedro, California. It was during, I think, 1795 storyline that I started watching, and it has stayed with me actively in my life since then.
I always love hearing from creators who've done some amazing things who it turns out are Dark Shadows fans and grew up watching it and love it. And that's really, really exciting because the show inspires so many people creatively, and it's had such an impact, I think, on the genre in general. And I want to get to that a little bit. But before we talk about Dark Shadows, I would love to hear about your upcoming play, which is called Double Feature. It sounds incredible. When you told me about it, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. It'll be premiering on February 8th through March 16th, I believe, at the Hampstead Theatre in London. So can you talk a little bit about that before we get into Dark Shadows?
It's, one of my great joys in life is, in the process, is watching actors work with directors, and whether it's on stage or on screen, to see the way that Ridley Scott or Marty Scorsese or Sam Mendes, how they communicate with an actor. It's a fascinating relationship because it's at once, as you know, very intimate and very public. So how actors and directors negotiate a world is always fascinating. And I've always been obsessed with the story of two stories: Alfred Hitchcock and Tippi Hedren making Marnie, and Vincent Price and Michael Reeves making Witchfinder General. And I thought there's something about these contentious relationships that is very dramatic. So first I thought, well, I'll do Alfred and Tip as one act, and I'll do Michael Reeves and Vincent Price, as the second act. And I thought, well, no, I'll just put them together, because in the theater, as well, you can accept surreal, you can accept abstract in that way. So the play deals with those four characters, and their highly charged relationships.
Is this going to be coming to the States at all? Do you know if it'll be?
Well, we hope. This is the
Yeah.
first production. I've been working on this play unbelievably for over 10 years. because it was very hard to get the sort of symphonic nature of two separate stories in different time periods happening at the same time. So this is the first production at the Hampstead Theatre. So hopefully people will like it. We'll continue to work on it. But that's up to the theater gods, as is most everything.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story with, Vincent Price and Michael Reeves did not, they butted heads a lot Reeves was such a young filmmaker, but it was a great performance by Vincent Price. He was terrifying in that role as Matthew
Terrifying.
Hopkins. Yeah.
And that's why when people look at theatrical actors like
Mm.
Vincent Price, like Thayer David, like
Mm.
Grayson Hall, it's easy to dismiss that as, well, that's melodrama, it's not real. And then you see the capacity of what they can do. And I always tell people when they want to diss Grayson Hall, I'm like, why don't you take 2 hours of your life and watch Night of Dark Shadows and watch
Yeah.
Carlotta and see a completely different skill set at work? That is a great actor. And I think the same is true of Vincent Price. People who only know him from the AIP Roger Corman films have a particular slant on what Vincent Price does, or they know him as Egghead, or they know him as one of the more theatrical characters. But Michael Reeves, coming from a completely different school of filmmaking, the auteur school, and it was Godard, it was Truffaut, and it was Pasolini, didn't want any of that. So the contentious relationship was about making Vincent Price give the performance of his lifetime. Because as you say, his Matthew Hopkins will chill your blood.
Yeah.
And there's no Grand Guignol, and there's no over the top, and there's no cape twirling. It is just, cold evil that's chilling to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So clearly, as you stated at the top of the show, you're a monster kid. You loved Dark Shadows. So how
Yeah.
did Dark Shadows fit into your world as a kid? Like, what was, in terms of being a monster kid, like, what can you talk a little bit about that, about your childhood?
Yeah, it did. I had an interesting childhood. My parents are from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and my father's a naval architect. So we would move sort of to port city growing up. So I lived all over. I lived in New Jersey, in San Pedro, in Mississippi, in Seattle, in Belfast. I lived everywhere growing up. But I always loved two things, which was Shakespeare and monsters. I was introduced to Shakespeare way too young, and it just stayed with me forever. Mostly because I think my dad, this sounds apocryphal, but it's completely true, sat me down and said, you need to watch this movie. And it was Olivier's Hamlet.
Wow.
Unbelievably scary ghosts, unbelievably exciting sword fight. And there was this other thing, which was Shakespeare. And so my dad really encouraged that. But my real love was monsters. And it was, it started with the Universal classics, obviously, all the shock theater package, with the first generation, then the second generation, which I consider to begin around Frankenstein meets the Wolfman to be the second generation.
Mhm.
And I would just watch those endlessly. There were 3 channels. I would watch them endlessly. Those and sort of the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes. I would watch those films sort of endlessly, and gradually was introduced to the Hammer films. And there was something about the creativity and imagination of those movies that just drew me in, and has really stayed with me. And then came Dark Shadows, and looking back, what I loved about Dark Shadows was 2 things I couldn't have realized when I was 7, which is the complexity of the characterization, because they had all the time, was so profound and probably influenced me most as a writer to this day. And the fact that they were fearless with story. And so Dark Shadows became a very safe place for me. And, in the middle of sort of my process, with Dark Shadows, we moved from San Pedro to Millburn, New Jersey, and we went from 3:30 to 4 o'clock, but it really stayed with me. And, Barnabas was a hero, and I dressed up as Barnabas, and I had as many collectibles as I could afford, and the comic books, and I obviously built the Aurora models and everything. So it's continually stayed with me throughout my life, periodically going back, watching the original series, the movies, the revivals, 2004, everything. Reading all the books, and it came back heavy when I started thinking about Penny Dreadful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I started rewatching episodes, which was very useful.
Yeah. Because I'm sure many who are listening to this have seen Penny Dreadful, but you took all of those classic horror characters from literature and put them together, which Universal did, which you mentioned, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, the first, shared universe, I guess, a Monster Rally films, and then Dark Shadows took inspiration from all of that and put them all together, and you did that in Penny Dreadful and had them all interacting with each other, which was really cool to
Yeah,
see.
and it was very much, when I was a kid, it was weirdly the second generation I loved more. I mean, I will always respect The Mummy, the Boris Karloff Mummy, as being
Mhm.
great art. The same with James the Whale Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula. I recognize and appreciate all of that. But what excited me was the Mad Monster Party, or the Monster
Yes.
Mashup, where suddenly it was Frankenstein the Wolfman, House of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, where all these storylines intersected in a really complex way. And I found that very exciting as a kid. I don't know why, but it was because it was so imaginative. And and I think because you could sort of chart a continuum of characters, particularly Larry Talbot,
Yeah.
you could chart that character through, it became a continuum. The way that Peter Cushing's Dr. Frankenstein became a continuum. And when we talk about Barnabas Collins, and the roots of the character, we obviously talk about Varney the Vampire and Dracula's daughter, the reluctant or semi-reluctant vampire. But I think Larry Talbot deserves a lot of mention as well,
Yes,
because
you're
he
right.
was so tormented
Yeah.
by what he became. He wanted to die frequently. And the character always walks that razor's edge of this thing I can't control and this thing I wish I had the morality to control, which is Barnabas Collins. So all of that, was really swirling in my head when I sat down to start creating Penny Dreadful. And I wanted to do Gothic. I wanted to do Dark Shadows. Truth be told, I tried to get the rights of Dark Shadows, and they were completely unavailable.
Oh no.
So so then I thought about doing Frankenstein, doing like the Peter Cushing version, where you just really spread it out. You continue the story. And then I thought, no, I need to do something that's more provocative than that. And certainly, in Penny Dreadful, I will say that to people who understand what this means, which is like, I embrace my House of Dark Shadows, Dan Curtis. So it's very bloody. It's very, the gore is gory, the guignol is guignol, as opposed to my ABC Studios. I
Right.
always tell people that. So like, I told my mother, I'm like, okay, the show's a little violent and there's a little sexuality. So be prepared.
One thing I often mention on the podcast, when people talk about Adam, they think about Adam becoming, getting rid of the scars and living a normal. No, that wouldn't. I think Adam would become like the creature Caliban, or in Penny Dreadful. I often call that out. And when I had writer Rich Hanley on the podcast, he referred to that character. He is venomous almost, just because of how he's treated, like in the novel too. I think Adam would become increasingly intelligent, but also embittered as he deals with the world. I don't think the scars would come off. I think the internal scars and the external
Exactly.
scars would still be there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. In all respect to Sam Hall, who I worship, it's like, the piece he wrote about, well, this is what'll happen to the Dark Shadows characters. I don't consider that canon. I consider that like the comic books, or like the Dan Ross novels, which I love. I consider that a different sensibility, so it's up to people like us to imagine what would have he become. But the essence of Frankenstein, the creature, to me, or Caliban, as we called him in Penny Dreadful, is torment, is inner torment, searching for beauty. In the case of Penny Dreadful, was poetry.
Yeah.
It was just tons of Keats and John Clare and romantic poetry. And in the case of our sainted Mary Shelley, it was language and philosophy.
Yeah.
And so when people sniff at horror, which they do,
Yes.
I say, you need to take the time and read Frankenstein and tell me it's not a provocative statement about what it is to be a human being.
When you talk about people sniffing at horror, which, I agree, they do. I think with Dark Shadows too, I think even among horror, there are a lot of horror fans, monster kids, that love Dark Shadows like we do. There are some that are not. I guess some have really gotten into it, and others found it slow. And I feel like Dark Shadows is such a pivotal part of the pantheon, I guess, of classic horror, of genre television. It had such an impact, but it doesn't get enough credit for it. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, and if you have advice for people that maybe want to check out the show and are having a difficult time absorbing it.
It's well, that's the big question, isn't it? It's how do we keep this show alive and vital, because it is important. And there's a couple ways to look at it, I think, and you've talked about this sort of brilliantly in your podcast before, which is like, look, it takes time, it takes attention. It's not you're not going to be satisfied initially. if there's something about the mood or the story or a character or an actor that intrigues you, hang in there. Because it was written, as we know, as a soap opera, and the length of time to watch the whole thing, which I did. I'll tell you about my marathon last year during the strike. But, you know, it requires attention, and attention is in short supply sometimes with some people. But what I would say to artists is it's imperative, I think, to understand where you are in the continuum of your art form. And for anyone involved in genre, you must recognize the majesty of Dark Shadows and what Dan Curtis and Sam Hall and Gordon Russell and all the performers and Robert Cole, you have to recognize what they did, which is they created the first serial narrative in speculative or terror fiction. And they did it right, and they did it first, and they did it with passion. Even the most sort of anemic of storylines, and every fan will know what that is for them, still has a sizzle to it that is thrilling to watch if you're willing to go there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And anything I mean, we talked over email a little bit about how Dark Shadows kind of created that template for the modern iteration
Yeah.
of horror on television. A lot of these shows now are serialized with all of these character driven storylines and dynamics, but infused with supernatural or otherworldly elements that feed into the whole thing. And Dark Shadows established that. And like you said, with passion, Dan Curtis, and this is why I championed Dan Curtis for the last year's Rondo Awards for the Monster Kid Hall of Fame, because Dan Curtis himself was a fan of those things. Which I'm sure was probably a challenge during that time too, to be, as you said, people kind of look down their nose at horror stuff. So I think he wanted to also obviously establish himself with something else, with Winds of War and War and Remembrance.
Right.
You know, when I had Mark DeWidziak on here, he was talking about how Dan Curtis didn't want on his tombstone the creator of Dark Shadows. Now it's the creator of Dark Shadows, Winds of War and Remembrance, and Dark Shadows.
Yes, exactly. Well, look, you know, there are innovators in art, and there are followers. And Dan Curtis was a great innovator. And that doesn't mean he wrote every episode, of course. He's the de facto head writer. You know, he worked with Art Wallace and Sam Hall and, you know, Violet Wells and everyone else to shape this very unique thing. And again, that had never been done before. To me, it's like the first time people see Picasso's Guernica, the first time it was unveiled to the world. How shocking that must have been. So to say to housewives or kids coming home from school, okay, so I want you to follow this story for 1,200, what is it, 45 episodes?
25, yeah.
25
well,
episodes.
They did double numbering on some of them
Yeah,
for preemptions. But
thank you for excusing my error there.
Oh, no.
True. Yeah, no. And so, you know, and I want you to follow it, and it's going to be unusual, and it's something you've never seen before. And when I hear it's something you've never seen before in art, I lean into that, because that's exciting, because I could turn the channel and watch anything in the world, or I could be inspired by anything else. But what that man did, and not only with Dark Shadows, I mean, I'm a huge Kolchak, you know, Night Stalker, Night Strangler, even the series, Trilogy of Terror, Burnt Offerings, you know, it's extraordinary, the fecundity of imagination to keep working and explore different areas of that genre. There should be a statue to Dan Curtis for what he did for artists like me, for other people who aren't artists, who were just inspired, who felt other, different, needed a place to fit in, wanted to be excited, wanted to laugh, wanted to be turned on. Whatever it was a very unique event.
Yeah.
And it still is a unique event if people are willing to open the door, step in and say, look, Jessica Fletcher's not going to solve the crime in an hour. You're not going to have special effects like you'd see now. What you're going to see is and this is what I tell people who don't know the show, it's like watching live theater.
Yes,
and
yes.
That is thrilling, because as you know, they were racing to get the show out. They were writing as the train was coming down the tracks at them and creating. And that gives it to me, because I grew up in the theater, I love the theater, an excitement that the most well-mannered, well-structured show cannot have. It has something else, but there's something about that energy that I find still to this day, when I was watching it last night, just intoxicating.
Yeah. Agreed. I think people sometimes tend to focus too much on the bloopers or whatever the mistakes, but it's like you said, it's like live theater. It's live to tape. And I tell people, you try doing that every day and see how that goes. I mean, they couldn't. I mean, they were limited in terms of what they could do in post-production. They didn't have time to
Yeah.
edit
Which I
until
love,
later. Until later.
well, until later, which I love because like sometimes great art is made under great pressure.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
you
yeah.
can have all the time in the world and produce mediocrity, but if like, you know, like being a screenwriter, you know, you walk on to the Coliseum set for Gladiator and there's 2,000 extras waiting and you need to write 3 lines.
Yeah.
And you have your steno pad and your Flare black pen and you need to deliver. And nothing happens until that happens. That sort of energy, and just not just writers, actors, directors, anyone involved in that sort of pressure, or it previews for a show, for a play, where it's like, it's not working. What do we do? Because we have an audience coming in 3 hours, you know, and we have so much rehearsal time. That to me is super exciting. That's one of the things that makes Dark Shadows so exciting for me personally, and all theater people should appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's also one of the reasons I love performing in improv troops, even though I'm getting a little long in the tooth or long in the fangs, I guess, for that. But it's my hips are get a little sore after all the running around. But improv is so, it's like walking on a tightrope without a net. You know, it's just there's that spontaneous energy that's going on there that I love, and who knows what's going to happen next, kind of a feel.
And sometimes you fall off the tightrope. It happens,
Yes.
you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's when people say to me, "Oh, Dark Shadows, the one with the cardboard tombstones, right, that fall over."
Yeah.
You know, it just sort of pisses me off because it's like I remember doing again Gladiator. It's like a year later, someone came up to me and said, "So you're from Gladiator? Well, you know, they had no paper then, so that was a mistake." And I said, "Why don't you tell it to the Best Picture Oscar?" You know, I was like, those things are just drive me insane.
That is the
'Cause it's
best
not,
comeback ever, by the way.
yeah, because it's not like it's entertainment, it's drama. There's nothing naturalistic about it, which is one of the other things I love about Dark Shadows. There is nothing naturalistic about that show.
Yes, agreed.
It is
Yeah.
heightened. It is heightened.
And I love that Dark Shadows exists, as Jonathan Frid used to call it, in the Dark Brigadoon, in its own world. Like they're not referencing you know, what's going on in the world, or products like Lucky Charms or whatever. You know, they're just in this weird world that exists on its own. It's sort of tethered to the real world a little, like they'll go to Bangor or Boston or something, you know, but
And
it's
occasionally when they do mention things from real life, it's especially in like the first year or so, it's sort of like, what? Wait, what are we talking about now? You
Yeah.
know, and I even remember when like you know, Victor Van Gibbon talks about like Kitchener and the Sudan. I'm like, oh my God, they're talking about
Yes.
they're talking about history. They're talking about Africa, Central Africa on
Yeah.
Dark Shadow. It seems very strange because maybe that's one of the reasons, you tell me, that Collinwood seems so safe, even though it was filled with murder weapons and dangerous people and poison and Angelique. You know, there was something about it that was set off. And for that 22, 25 minutes, you were in a safe space where Vietnam didn't matter, Watergate didn't matter, being gay and having asthma didn't matter,
Yeah.
because this was a place where none of that existed. What existed was magic.
Yes. Yeah, there is something very mystical about Collinwood. It is an escape. And I've said it before on the podcast too. Like the Collinwood of the TV show is a place I'd want to live, even with all the werewolves and witches and vampires. I still want to live. There is something safe. Whereas the Collinwood of, as much as I love House and Night of Dark Shadows, I don't think I'd want to live in that. I'd want to go see that Collinwood before the sun sets, but I don't.
Yeah, and it's also it's also not just living in the place, because I agree, but it's also like, I want to dance with Carolyn at the Blue Whale. I want to flirt with Quentin. You know, I want to commiserate with Barnabas when he's melancholy, because after a while, and again, this is like the strength of continuing narrative, these people become so familiar to them, you get engaged in their lives, and in a weird sort of way, they get engaged in your lives too, because as questions of ethics and morality and sexuality and religion and theology are all in Dark Shadows. All of them. if you open your heart and your mind to them.
Yeah, and you carried that over into Penny Dreadful as well. A lot of what you just described exists in the world of Penny Dreadful too. So there are definitely I was picking up on a lot of these echoes as I watched it. So you mentioned several characters just now, so I want to dive a little bit into that. One of the messages you sent me was about talking about the marvelous David Hennessy, Thayer David, Nancy Barrett. Let's talk about some of your favorite characters from the show, storylines. Let's dive
Yeah,
into what do you
great.
love?
What I love is, when people say like, where should I start Dark Shadows?
Mhm.
Not that people like bang on my door to say that all the time, but people do ask because I talk about
Yeah.
it a lot, and I have a Barnabas Collins phone,
Oh, nice.
and I always say like, well, really, to truly understand the show, you've got to start with Barnabas coming out of the coffin. But
Mhm.
even before that, I think you have to watch episode 191, which is the episode where Laura the Phoenix burns and her son is traumatized. And to me, still one of the most frightening things is that scream that David Hennessy does. The absolute terror of that is so true. And then at the end of the show, there's this amazing scene with Victoria Winters and David in which she's tucking him in it, and he's hypothetically doesn't remember what happened. But the subtext between those two actors is so subtle about like, that didn't really happen, did it? And she's like, no, but you both know that like, yeah, this trauma is buried deep, even if he doesn't remember it now. And I know people sometimes give her and the character a bad rap. And I'm like, watch that scene. This is great acting.
Yeah.
So I was telling people, watch that episode so you understand the emotional capacity this show can deliver, because it's not going to deliver all the time, you know. And then when Barnabas emerges from the coffin, there's things I just love, like Jason McGuire.
Yeah.
Jason McGuire, Dennis Patrick, with a almost flawless Irish accent, being Irish myself, his relationship with Willie's relationship with Barnabas, which looking back at now, I look at John Carlo with that amazing sort of young Richard Widmark look, and I say, oh, is this a coded queer subtext between these characters? Because Jason McGuire talks about it, outside the old house. That's interesting. But to me, the reason to watch all of that, and of course you have the introduction of Julia, you have the beginning of that relationship, is to do with the central, I think, engine of the show, which is the question of morality. And you see Julia being manipulated by a brutal Barnabas, who I love, and I love when he explores his heroic sides, fighting off the werewolf with the silver-headed cane to protect Carolyn. I love that as well. But there's something about the basic of that character who is so complex and complicated in the questions of good and evil, and it all comes down to the ghost of Sarah.
Yes. Nailed it.
Sarah comes in, you have that amazing, I think, recorder, London Bridge, and she comes, and she's in a lot, and people see her and they don't see her, and people pretend to see her. Carolyn and Dr. Hoffman are like having a fight about a love for Barnabas, but Sarah keeps coming into episode, I can't remember the episode number, where she finally has the scene with Barnabas.
Yes.
And it's so climactic, because Barnabas is one of his most barbaric, bestial behaviors toward Julia, who we love and loves him. And then he finally sees his dead sister's ghost.
Yeah.
And the scene between them is as good as anything that has ever been on television. And the brilliant, Gordon Russell wrote it. I remember that. And to me, the heart of the entire series is the one line. It's what Barnabas used to teach his little sister, the little poem, so she would learn how to read and write. And I wrote down that evil is wicked is well understood. The wicked are punished, so you must be good.
Yeah.
That's what Dark Shadows is about. And that's why Barnabas Collins is the protagonist.
Yes.
Because that question lingers through all the characters.
Yes.
All the way through, but it's the central driving mechanism. What are you going to do in horrible circumstances? How do you respond to Angelique? And so that's why I say that storyline is the bedrock for what I believe is the dramaturgical and emotional core of the show.
I agree. I think you nailed it there. And it's a huge turning point for Barnabas as well. I mean, I was just talking with Mary O'Leary a couple of days ago. I don't know. Did you watch the Jonathan Frid documentary?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just talking with her, and I told her, when we're talking about the scene with that scene with Sarah and the
Yeah.
scene where Sarah dies in 1795. I said those two scenes always make me cry. To this day, I get very emotional watching those scenes, and it's fascinating. Like I said, I think putting Barnabas in a box of he's the good guy, he's the bad guy, he's the protagonist of the show, but Jonathan Frid loved he always said I liked playing between the two poles. He liked playing those shades of gray. Sometimes Barnabas could be very heroic, but sometimes he could be really dark and do some disturbing things,
Yeah,
especially
monstrous.
monstrous
Yeah,
things. Yeah,
monstrous.
especially
Yeah.
early on. But even throughout the series, there are times when
Right.
Barnabas there's some morally ambiguous things happening, but that trajectory does happen with all the characters where they a lot, like you said, with definitely with Quentin, Angelique too, even ultimately Angelique,
Of
because I
course.
think Angelique, there's a tendency in spin-off media sometimes, licensed media or other iterations where Angelique tends to be very one-dimensional, but she wasn't one-dimensional in the series at all. She was a multifaceted. She starts out pretty bad, but you still feel for Angelique throughout the series. Lara Parker was fantastic.
But in a really controversial statement, because I love me my Jonathan Frid, I think Laura Parker and Angelique is the most complicated character on that show. Not just
Mm,
following her timelines, which are dizzying, but
mm,
the way she's able to play all those levels of Angelique, from absolute venom to absolute love, and every gradation between, so incredibly honestly. And
mm.
interesting, you may know this, but I was reminded recently that in Bob Fosse's All That Jazz, the great movie, the Angel of Death, played by Jessica Lange, is named Angelique.
Oh,
And I'm like,
wow.
I bet Bob Fosse was at some like sweet charity rehearsal and it was on, and that name stayed in his head. That's what I'm going to say anyway.
I bet you're right. I bet you're right.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And then the trans character you had in Penny Dreadful, you named Angelique. Was that an homage to?
Of course,
Oh, cool.
yes, yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Oh, very cool. It's I'm just jumping real back to the David Hennessy and the Phoenix
Mm,
storyline. That was a really innovative idea too. The Dark Shadows
yeah.
took the concept of a phoenix from mythology and reimagined that as a humanoid being that wants to take her is reborn every few
And
decades
it's
and wants to
it's
take her kid into the flames.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, who thought of that? Now, I think, the classical antecedents to that, I think, are Medea,
Yeah.
who obviously tried to enact revenge on her children through fire. But to do that in 1960, whatever it was, on daytime television at 3:30 in the afternoon, and to do it so well
Yeah.
it's mind-boggling to me that they would do something like that.
Yeah.
And also, David Hennessy. And that scene also is a counterpoint to what I think is, to me, the most chilling scene in the entire series. And it's my favorite storyline, which is 1897.
Oh, I love
Um,
1897. That's my favorite.
18,
So,
I mean, I love 1995 we'll talk
oh,
about. We have
love
to
it.
talk
Yeah.
about Judah Zachary's head.
Yes.
But what the other thing I tell people, if they don't like, those people who consider black and white a genre and they don't like black and white, and they want to watch something else, weirdly, I don't send them to 1795. I don't send them to the origin story, because I'm like, this is like a great musical number at the end of a Broadway show, and it is to be so enjoyed. It is so operatic. The acting is so great. Naomi and Joshua are unbelievable characters. Introduce Angelique, but I send them to 1897, because
Same
to me
here.
that has a verve to it, and it
Mhm.
introduces like several of my favorite characters. As I've said to you, Count Petofi. If you
Yeah.
said pick a favorite character, is Count Petofi. Because if I could write a character like Count Petofi, I would die happy. And interestingly, when I was working on Skyfall, and I was thinking about Silva, the villain character, I thought back to Count Petofi and his relationship with Aristide, which was so bizarre, like, my boy. And I'm like, what's going on here? And the missing hand. So there was a certain amount of physical handicap thing. So I went back to my very favorite character, Count Petofi, and just the notion of that box open and there's a severed hand in it.
Yes.
That's when I began to think they're literally writing this show for me, for like John Logan in San Pedro, California on Mantis Avenue. They're writing the show to me. Victor Fenn-Gibbon, Count Petofi, Magda, anything with Nicholas Blair, I love the pieces, because Humbert Allen Estredo, one of those actors, and there's different kinds of actors as well, who just delights in performing.
Yeah.
And he inspires such confidence, doesn't he? When Nicholas Blair walks in with the hat and the gloves and the eyeshadow, I was like, damn, that is an actor who knows what he's doing and loves to do it.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's the storyline that I love the most. And there's Quentin Zombie, which I think is terrifying, crawling toward the grave. I think David Shelby is outstanding in the show. But the moment is episode 801, 802. And it's when Count Petofi sort of passes the curse on to Jameson, to David Hennessy.
I love that. Yes.
And it's that little kiss passing on a sort of curse of honesty and despair through a kiss. It was so chilling to me, so wrong in every way.
Yeah.
And they played it exquisitely. And then David Hennessy doing Count Petofi, doing Thayer David, doing
Brilliant.
Count Petofi. Extraordinary. So like sometimes I just think David Hennessy doesn't get the love he needs to get from us.
Oh, agreed. I totally agree. And I one of my favorite scenes from that sequence involves Louis Edmonds, who is also wonderful.
Always.
Yeah, Louis Edmonds as Edward and David Hennessy as Jameson possessed by Count Petofi, and he's gonna drink some brandy. And Louis Edmonds throws a fit. What are you doing? And then he goes and drinks something. He goes to drink something else, and Edward is upset about it. He says, "Mineral water, good for the digestion."
I know. And this again, all praise to Louis Edmonds, because he's another one of those actors that every time he enters, where it's Roger or Joshua or Edward, I get excited because on one hand, he could be incredibly witty and wry. And I'm like, he just wandered in from Design for Living. And I love it. He should wear a smoking jacket. And the other hand, he could break your heart. To me, 1795 is the tragedy of Joshua.
Yeah.
And and Naomi, but how he's able to chart that as a performer is absolutely extraordinary to me. And another reason, by the way, I think it's so important that people watch, if they can, from Barnabas coming out of the coffin, is the amazing scene where Roger Collins talks about what it was like to grow up in Collinwood, and he thinks about those portraits, haunting him, and you get an insight into him that will explain so much about his relationship with his son and with the world around him. Of course, he put up a brittle exterior to protect himself. And, David Hennessy doesn't have that protection around him, and will probably end up being a happier character, than Roger was. But I think Louis Edmonds is extra. I love his Edward. I love his Edward mustache. I love, Amadeus, and particularly Brutus, where it's like Louis Edmonds playing like a pirate, essentially. And again, the range of those actors, is astounding to me.
I mean, you meant, talking about Count Petofi. I mean, Thayer David, every role, I mean, a lot of them were very distinct, but some were similar, but like evil. Like you have Matthew Morgan, who's like kind of the bad. Then you have Ben, who's like kind of the good version of Matthew Morgan, and then you have something that's totally different with Professor Stokes, who's very, very much a kind of a Van Helsing kind of sage, occult scholar, but very witty also,
walking around looking at your antiques, seeing if they're real or not. It's like, who does that? That's amazing. Go T. Elliot Stokes, I say.
Fantastic. And Nancy Barrett, too, who I feel also deserves a lot of credit, because she was such a versatile character actress. I mean, she just would take on these really fascinating roles. I mean, her parallel time Carolyn, that kind of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf thing they were doing with William Hollinshead Loomis and Carolyn Loomis, and she was amazing, and that was heartbreaking.
Extraordinary. I think that the secret weapons of Dark Shadows are Thayer David and Nancy Barrett.
Agree.
Because if you look at Carolyn all the way through, and I love the real time characters very much, and the way she's able to play silly, foolish, bitchy, completely honestly, heartbroken. Carolyn Loomis, as you say, it's like, oh, she's had one too many Gin Rickeys. And
Yeah.
what is that doing to the character we love? And then Millicent comes on,
Yeah.
in 1795. And I'm like, how can she do that? Her whole body is different. The way she moves her
Yeah.
head is different. Her voice is different. And then there's Pansy Faye.
Yes.
And my two favorite sequences from House of Dark Shadows, which I adore and watch way too often, are Carolyn sequences. It's the scene with David in the pool house, and in the pool, which
Terrifying.
is
Super scary.
terrifying. And then the staking. And I think
Yeah.
the staking of Carolyn in House of Dark Shadows is, to me, the single best killing of a vampire I've ever seen. The special effects aren't the best, but it's harrowing in the way killing anything should be,
Mhm.
to communicate, to mean something to an audience. So, Nancy Barrett, hat off to you for all those years, all those characters, each one of them subtle and true.
We haven't talked a whole lot yet about the movies. So did you go see House and Night of Dark Shadows in the theater when it
Yeah.
came out? Yeah. Oh, great.
Yeah, I did, eagerly and many times. And like, I have the iPad I travel with. I have about 10 seasons of Dark Shadows and both the movies, always,
Mm.
And House of Dark Shadows, I think, is magnificent. I think it's a magnificent movie. I love the fact that Dan Curtis used that camera like a feral animal moving
Mhm.
around those sets, because there's such verve and energy to it. And do all the trick shots work? No, of course not. But God love him for trying. I don't, because the series, as you know, they had those cameras which were as big as dinosaurs. They're
Yeah.
trying to move around from set to set quickly and not run over the cables or the boom guy. And suddenly he had the freedom to have verve to the storytelling. And he went for it fully, like Dark Shadows always does. And I love the fact it's bloody. Why not? It's different. That's not going to kill Dark Shadows. It's just very different,
Yeah.
And I love the fact that Barnabas is complicated and brutal, as well as romantic, and seeing the sun for the first time, walking with the great Catherine Lee Scott. I love that movie. I could watch it endlessly, because I love, there's the music cue I know, there's oh, look who's there, just at the funeral scene, so
Yeah.
it's, for a fan, it's good, but also for a horror genre fan, for when it came out and what it meant to American cinema as opposed to Hammer cinema, I think it was staking a claim to something new and exciting. And I understand why fans don't like it. I understand why
A lot of
they,
fans like it, but some don't because it's too hard. I mean, a lot of more fans dislike Night of Dark Shadows, I would say, than
right,
House, but there are fans who don't like House of Dark Shadows because it's
yeah,
more. Jonathan didn't like I love House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows actually,
yeah,
but yeah.
yeah, as do I, And I think Night of Dark Shadows gets the bummest rap of anything in Dark Shadows,
Mhm.
including the Ben Cross series, including the Alec Newman, potential revival. I think it's the worst rap, because clearly, Dan Curtis was doing something different. He did something very autumnal, and
Mhm.
suddenly it's like watching an art film or a European film, and it takes its time to develop its themes, and if you're impatient, like James Aubrey from the studio was, and said, I'm not going to sit here for 2 hours and 20 minutes, cut half of it out, cut 40 minutes out, do it, butcher the thing, then you're going to hate that movie.
Yeah.
But if you listen to that opening score, the theme, and you watch the car and the rain starts and they put up that's the movie and you're in.
Yep.
And within that, it has Carlotta, which is out Danvers, Mrs. Danvers, as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned, in terms of great performance. It's got Nancy Barrett and John Carlin as really interesting characters, and at the center it has David Selby and Kate Jackson. And Kate Jackson is another one I think probably doesn't get the love she should, for what she did for Dark Shadows and what she brought to it.
Yeah.
When Daphne and Gerard are introduced, I personally find them more frightening than Quentin as a ghost, because there's something about her before she becomes like a sympathetic character, that's so terrifying about her
Yeah.
bone structure, the way she looks. And James Storm, I adore.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I probably didn't understand why I adored him quite so much. Now I do more. It's so powerful together. And the fact that she had a regional accent, I find so refreshing in that show, that you got traces of the Alabama, was it? Or you get traces of her
Yeah.
accent.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love the fact that it's not another sort of New York trained actor, although she was delivering the standard Dark Shadows speak.
Yeah.
And she is the center of Night of Dark Shadows, as you know. It
Yeah.
is Tracy's story,
Yes.
and I find it very compelling. I hope desperately we get to see the complete version sometime.
Same here. I've had Darren Gross on the podcast, who's been for a long time spearheading the
Yeah.
restoration. He found lost footage. He's redubbed the audio. He still needs to do a few more things, but it's going to take Warner Brothers ponying up some money to actually make it happen, to put it out. And that's the problem, is Warner's doesn't seem to really be all that interested in doing that right now, but I'm
Yeah.
hopeful that I mean, we're all kind of waiting for this thing to happen. They still need
Yeah.
to redub Grayson. I don't know if they would do that now with AI technology, or how I mean,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
They
because
they probably could.
yeah, they probably could. I mean,
Wow.
I watched some of those Star Wars shows on Disney Plus, and they had
Mm.
Darth Vader in one of them, and I said, "Oh wow, James Earl Jones came back to voice Darth Vader." No, it was they did it. They sampled his voice and did it. He gave them permission to do it, and
Yeah.
they did Darth Vader, but it sounded like him. So they
Yeah.
probably could do that with Grayson. I would imagine, because she has such a distinct voice. I know Darren had
Yeah.
said when she was still alive, they were thinking of Eileen Brennan possibly to do. She
Yeah.
would have been good
Yeah.
too, but
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
they could do it with AI. You mentioned, Gerard and Daphne. 1995, you mentioned earlier too as one of your
Oh,
favorites. Yeah, great
oh,
storyline, a great short,
great
but so
story.
cool.
Yeah, and the fact that it was short probably helped it in a way. But when we see Collinwood destroyed,
Mhm.
it's so emotional for me
Yeah. Oh,
because
same.
I love that house. I've lived in that house. I have pictures of the house all over my house. And to see it, and they did such a great job in destroying it. They really went for it. It wasn't like, well, we're gonna put a picture on. We have a damn tree in the middle of the house. Everything's falling to pieces. It was so visceral and so
Mhm.
beautifully done, and presented the apocalyptic question, which is like, it's all over. Can we stop this?
Yeah.
And whenever you go into the past, whether it's the I Ching or a Stairway Through Time, or the magic secret number of the universe or an herb, and you have a mission, even if you forget the mission, well, I think it's very compelling. And 1995 for me is so provocative because it makes you ask all those questions that we ask now. Like, well, what happened to Carolyn? What happened to Roger and Elizabeth? What happened to David?
Yeah.
And you get to see some of that answer, how they answered some of those questions. And Carolyn, again, Nancy Barrett is so heartbreaking,
Oh, yeah.
in that storyline. And of course, you have the great supernatural element, the sort of redo of Turn of the Screw with Gerard, which is fantastic. I find that when I get to that in the series, I always get very excited. It's
Yeah.
one of those moments I'm like, who thought to do this, number one, and how did they do it so well? And one of the challenges to writers like me is like, how did they do this so well? Not even how did they do this so well day after day after day after day for years, but how did they come up with that idea that's so fresh,
Yeah.
and so original? I love that to pieces.
I
And it eventually, leads us to other great storylines. So, into Judah Zachary's head, which
yeah.
you can't touch in terms of greatness for me.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love the head of Judas. I love when we go to summer 1970, which they're doing elements of for sure of Turn of the Screw, but also Beckoning Fair one with Quentin being in love with the ghost of Daphne. And like you said, there was
Yeah.
a malevolent aspect to Daphne. We weren't sure where, if she was good or evil or what, but as we find out, she becomes more sympathetic. But at first, she's hugging Quentin and holding the dagger behind him, and
Yes.
so
Yes.
but they were doing some interesting things there, and I'm sure that the vampire Roxanne was probably a nod to Carmilla as well. I mean, it wasn't the
Of
same
course.
story
Yeah.
as Carmilla, but it was kind of a
Yeah.
nod to that. But then we get to 1840, and I think they
Yeah.
kind of changed gears, like, let's do something different. So Gerard ends up being possessed by Judah Zachary. But I loved the whole head of Judah Zachary thing, and the fact that they were doing the thing that couldn't die. on Dark Shadows.
Yeah,
is
after you talked about that on your podcast, I like got the movie, ordered the DVD, and I watched it because Judah Zachary, the head of Judah Zachary, is truly one of my favorite things in life. That they did that and did it so well. And I watched that movie and I'm like, it's exactly Judah Zachary's head, the warlock. And that movie, for I don't know, they shot it probably 6 days. It's really good.
It
It
is
really
good,
has
yeah.
like freaky. The guy who plays the sort of warlock, the pirate warlock, is
Gideon
amazing.
Drew, yeah.
You know?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
yeah, another thing about sort of is Chris Panic. Let's talk a little bit about
Oh, I
Chris Panic.
love
Only
Chris
because of-
Pennock. Yes.
me too. And when Chris Panic enters, well, first of all, the Leviathan storyline is I know people don't like it. I love it.
Same.
You I love it. Because to me, any Dark Shadows is better than no Dark Shadows, whether it's a comic book, a Ross novel, or even if it's Bramwell, any storyline is better than not having it. Because what else are you going to fill that with? There's a space in your heart that needs to be filled with Dark Shadows. And the parallel time for me, I mean, not parallel time, the Leviathans for me, one of the things I find most frightening, and maybe it's just me, is the sound of that breathing.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
I think it's whoever did that really well. And the only sort of oral clue that matches it is the wolves outside the window.
Yeah.
You know, in Maggie's bedroom. It's like that is terrifying just to hear and imagine.
Yeah.
You know, and then Chris Pennock comes in and you suddenly say, we're in 1970. This is a modern show.
Yeah.
You know, because he has this modern energy to him. He's got blonde ringlets, you know, and then he's Sebastian Shaw, even more modern.
Yeah.
So I think that injected a really good jolt of sort of contemporary 1970 energy into sort of our beautiful Gothic world in a way, as did the women's fashion and various things. But yeah, I always am delighted when Chris Pennock enters. And I personally think the two kids who play the various stages getting up to him are terrifying.
Yeah.
Terrifying. And
They are.
you know,
Agree. Yeah.
haunted children. Go back to the innocence.
It's
you know,
it's always scary. Even David earlier on, when he was kind of the bad seed, you know, doing like locking
what did Roger call him?
an incipient psychopath.
Again, if I could write a line like that, I'd be so happy. You know?
It's a great line.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like Leviathans. I think the audience just wasn't ready for that. I don't know if it's because they weren't familiar with the works of H.P. Lovecraft, but a lot of people probably weren't. And Dan Curtis, you know, read the Dunwich Horror and he wanted to do that. And I thought it was cool. Also, people were turned off by, I think, Barnabas being really cold. I mean, Barnabas always did do bad things, but he was passionate, but he was very cold and he was under the control of this other force. So I think fans did not react well to that. But to this day, a lot of fans don't like the Leviathans. I really like the Leviathans. I love every Dark Shadow storyline on it. It's difficult for me to say I don't like this storyline, but everybody has their favorites. I mean, there's some I like more than others, but are there any that are not as much your favorites, I guess?
You know, there are certain storylines that, and it's nothing to do with the writing or the acting or the directing. It's like the Addams storyline for me is not as engaging as I wish it were for me. Again, it's nothing to do with Robert Rodin. It has to do with me and my feelings about the Frankenstein creature and that storytelling. However, when Eve enters, I am all in.
Yeah,
you know,
she's great.
Marie Wallace, you have to be all in because she will give you no choice. Much like Grayson Hall, she will give you no choice but to believe.
Yeah.
You know, so that storyline I always get a little impatient with because it's, you know, people are locked up a lot. It's like versus Carolyn, then it's Vicky. So I don't get so engaged with that. You know, and there are moments in you know, Bramwell and Catherine. You know, as much as I love the lottery aspect of it, and I love Brutus Collins, and I love, you know, there are moments in that I was like, they're not my particular favorites. You know? Oh, here's a question about the Leviathans for you. Do you think part of the reason people didn't and don't respond to it is because the show is showing vampires and werewolves and ghosts, and this was something that we didn't see? Do you think that's one of the reasons that people don't respond to it? It wasn't a readily recognizable horror creature?
Yes, I think so. That's kind of what I guess what I meant when I about people not being familiar with the works of H.P. Lovecraft is they didn't know what that was. Like they didn't pick like vampires, werewolves, ghosts, witches. Everybody knows what those are, but who knows what this is? This unseen monster that and what is this
Yeah.
eldritch race that
Right.
once held sway over the earth. And I think that's
Yeah.
probably why they had to put it in some kind of content, have them in league somehow with, or under the power of Diablos, with Nicholas Blair as sort of
Yeah.
being called in to kind of write the course there. I think it's so that they could put it so the audience could understand what was going on, or put it in some kind of
Yeah.
context that they would understand. I suspect that was part of it. I loved, I mean, I agree with you. The breathing was just so creepy. It's that terror versus
Yeah.
horror thing. It's like,
Yes.
what do you think it looked like though? Like, I did want to see it. I remember when I was a teenager by the time I watched Leviathans, but I remember wishing I could see what it looked like. What do you have any thoughts on
Well,
what it looks like?
I would like one day to be mature enough to not care what it looks like, but every time I'm like, oh, Paul Stoddard, camera go there, just because you just have that. I'm like, it's in my head, I think it's sort of like the electrical monster from Forbidden Planet. It's animated, or it's something not the usual.
Interesting.
We're just filming something. And I
Yeah.
think the snake, like the Naga box, the snakes, the heads, Medusa-y, but animated, or some special effect thing that's not a person, or not, the way they
And
sometimes did the bats, not incredibly well necessarily, but they did something abstract in terms of presenting something real,
yeah.
which I thought was great. But the other thing I always think about Leviathan is when people get frustrated. And I have friends who love Dark Shadows, and we talk about it, obviously.
Mhm.
And they get frustrated. I'm like, well, there's a reason that the Greeks didn't put the violence on stage.
Yeah.
When Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon in the bathtub, it's off stage. And the idea being that what the audience will imagine is better than any stagecraft we can produce. It will
Agreed.
be more,
Yeah.
there will be more terror or horror, in terms
Yeah.
of viscera and blood than we have the capacity to make. So therefore, we'll do it off stage.
Yeah.
So that tradition runs, long and hard. It's not embraced nowadays, because I think that our current desire for sensationalism and to be entertained every 15 seconds by something precludes the idea necessarily of a movie like The Innocents, the Jack
I
Clayton
love The
Innocents,
Innocents. Yeah.
which I love The Innocents, and
Yeah.
practically nothing happens, but it's terrifying. Just the way that story is told, the way it's filmed and shot, but you don't see horrific anything,
Right. I have a framed poster of The Innocents in this room on the other side there. And I love the scene with that scene with Miles in front of the window and the rain's coming down, and the ghost of Peter Quint is laughing and Miles is laughing too. And they did that in Dark Shadows too. Innocence is Turn of the Screw, for those who haven't watched it or read it. But it's they didn't do it with the window, but David's laughing in his bed, and you hear Quentin laughing in the house, his laughter echoing, and Elizabeth is just standing there. Yeah, it's such a chilling scene to this day.
It's so chill. I literally just got chills when you were describing it. And the other thing about The Innocents is that kiss between the boy and Deborah Kerr is like a little Jameson, Count Petofi, Jameson passing on through a curse, something it's loving, but it's really disturbing through a kiss,
Yeah. When you mentioned 1841 parallel time in the lottery and all, I really like it, but it's for me, I just wish we had some connection to the main time band, that some character in that, like how Barnabas went into parallel time in 1970, and Julia did too. I mean, the idea that they brought in a parallel universes into Dark Shadows is wild, that they did that at all. That, again, another crazy thing. I mean, they did it in Star Trek too. They did parallel universe with sci-fi show. You don't expect in Dark Shadows that they're going to have, but they did that. In 1841, I just wish we had some tether to the primary time band. I think that's part of also why fans kind of don't connect with it as much.
Yeah, I agree. It's because we have fallen in love with those real world characters who are like us in the real world. So seeing them in an alien situation, makes us uncomfortable, because we're in that alien situation. So I'm sorry about that. It's a good moment to talk about Mitch Ryan.
Oh, yes.
Because it has to do with casting as well, and recasting, and who's because they have a repertory company. And when Mitch Ryan left the show as Burke Devlin, I think the show lost something for me.
Yeah.
Because I love Burke Devlin, one of my favorite characters. And again, no disrespect to the other actor whatsoever. but a different energy, a different DNA that wasn't to me as engaging. Even as Jeremiah, I didn't connect with that character, and I kept thinking, oh my God, if Mitch Ryan were doing this with Jonathan Frid, this scene would be the most thrilling thing in the
Yeah.
world. And 1841 Parallel Time, I feel a bit of that as well. A bit like, oh, I wish maybe a different actor had been playing that part. Maybe I'd be more comfortable with that. Maybe that a character I knew or an actor I knew would make that more accessible to me,
Right.
or more homey in a way.
I mean, Anthony George, I did like him as Jeremiah. I think Mitch Ryan as Jeremiah, I think he would have been fantastic, but it would have been a very different Jeremiah. I don't think he would have been I think there would have been an edge, a much harder edge to that Jeremiah. But I would have been fascinating. He was an amazing actor. And
Actor.
I do agree with you that Dark Shadows lost something when he left the show. He was fantastic. It's such a shame,
Now,
but
let me ask you, in 1795, one of the things in the revival series, which I liked for a lot of reasons, is Barnabas and Jeremiah being brothers, with Adrian Paul. I thought that was brilliant. I thought that was a real innovation, and I understand why they didn't do it, but don't you think that would have been more compelling in our, sort of our Dark Shadows?
Yeah,
Or did they, yeah.
I think so, because I mean, it feels more personal when the betrayal happens. Well, thanks to Angelique with Josette, that his brother is the one versus his uncle. So yes, I mean, I think it's still effective in the original show, but I'm sure that's why they altered it, for the revival. Catherine Lee Scott too. Speaking of Josette, she was wonderful too, and you've met her before, haven't you?
I have. I've met two Dark Shadows people in my life. Lara Parker signed a picture for me years ago at an autographing thing, which I still have over my desk. It was one of the vampire pictures. And I met Catherine because I sent her sort of a fan letter. She responded, we communicated. Then I went to Lyndhurst, and I met her at the thing that she did there last year. And it was fantastic talking to her, because she's another one of the, I think, unsung heroes of Dark Shadows, is Catherine Lee Scott, not just for what she's done to keep the flame alive so vibrantly, but for her performance. It's hard to be the moral center who has to go through so much. But when she's imprisoned by Barnabas, I believe her anguish. I believe every second of it. When she's tormented in 1795 at the death of one husband, then of Barnabas, and I believe that entirely. And her Kitty Hampshire, I think, is one of the great performances that I love so much, that she got to do that as well. Again, a subtle actor, not playing naturalism like Nancy Barrett, not playing naturalism, but playing completely believable.
Yeah, she's a very skilled actress. I was at that Lyndhurst event too. We must have gone on different days. Yeah,
No.
yeah. I went down there and I met her and Marie Wallace, and just so wonderful. They were both so nice. I had a great time talking with both of them. I've had them both on the podcast before too. I have to bring Catherine back on for a solo episode at some point, because I would love to. I chatted with her about the Christmas Carol event that they did with the whole cast online, which was really fun. Jumping back to 1897, that's also where I tell people who are maybe having a hard time with the earlier episodes to jump in, because 1897 is very colorful, it's very vibrant, and it moves a little faster. I mean, I give them some background on what's happened before then, but it is epic. When I say, well, start with episode 700, they're like, episode 700. What about the first 700 episodes? I said, well, those are important too, but if you really want to get hooked, I think 1897 is the way to do it.
Yeah, I agree. It's like 1795 is grand opera, and 1897 is operetta in a great way. And again, there's so much going on in that storyline, and you get things like, and here's a werewolf, and here's a zombie, and here's a vampire, and here's a warlock with a hand, and it's so imaginative. It's like the genie has opened the bottle and spilled it all on the table.
Yeah.
And if you respond to that, you're going to love the rest of the series, because again, as you say, very colorful, very fast moving. And you know, you start with Magda.
Magda, I love
How
Magda. Oh my God.
Magda and Magda and Sandor are so
Yes.
loving. So
Yes.
like playful and loving and wicked all at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, it's a magnificent. Whenever I get to that point, I sort of my heart sort of fills because I know some of my favorite stuff's coming up.
Yeah. I love Magda and Sandor. They're always, ribbing each other or, getting on each other's
Yeah.
nerves, but they love each other. They're an old married couple.
Yeah.
They're sweet to watch, and it's heartbreaking. And there's never a happy ending for these, which Maggie and Joe, I love Maggie and Joe. They're just such a sweet
Yeah.
couple. And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
the intrusion of the supernatural into their
Yeah.
lives just
Yeah,
destroyed
that's so interesting because in classic theater there's comedy and there's tragedy, and comedy is when characters get their just rewards for their choices, and tragedy is when they don't. And like, is Dark Shadows a comedy or a tragedy? Because very little ends happily. I actually love the little tag at the end in the last episode because it gives me a little hope. At least Nancy Barrett and John Carlin are having this thing, and maybe it wasn't a vampire. So and that's important because so many of the characters end in a really dreadful way, in a really dire way. Even now when I watch, honestly, when I watch Night of Dark Shadows, I stop it before that final credit roll.
Oh yeah, okay,
Because
yeah.
it's so the movie is profoundly melancholy and tragic enough just in Tracy and Quentin's story. But then to have that sort of thrown in as, oh, and by the way, these other characters who had some hope and a great life ahead of them
Yeah.
and were writers, they died too with
They
the
died
mist filling
too.
the car. So it's like
Yeah.
that evil continues, and
Yeah.
it's sort of a profound question of Dark Shadows, I think. Comedy or tragedy.
Mhm. Again, I wanted my friend Eric Marshall, when I told him that I was going to be interviewing him, that he designed the logo for the podcast. He's a
Oh,
brilliant artist, yeah. And he says to tell you, Rory Kinnear was the ultimate audience surrogate in that last shot of season 3, staring in disbelief at Vanessa's grave. Dang, but that hurt.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that was intended to be a tragedy. It's like I started Penny Dreadful with that character. She was going to be my Victoria Winters, my Barnabas Collins, however you choose to say it. I knew that was my protagonist, because I wanted to write about a woman in Victorian society who was literally and figuratively corseted, and was tormented and had demons, but was the hero, much like Barnabas Collins, and Barnabas Collins played in my head a lot when I was creating Ava Green's character. And Ava became sort of a muse for me, and we worked so closely together. And I knew I wanted to end the show, and I knew I wanted to write the end, and finish that story. And the first person I cast in the show is Rory Kinnear, who plays the creature, and he's a
He was
great actor.
amazing, yeah.
Right. And I'd worked with him on the 2 Bond films. I'd seen him, on stage a lot. So I built the show around Rory, saying like every actor who steps on this soundstage needs to have that capacity.
Yeah.
So it took forever to cast, but I knew I wanted to end with that character, with those 2 characters, even with one of them in the ground, as the ending to that particular tragedy.
In that final season too, you've introduced Dr. Jekyll, which
Yeah.
I loved Christopher Pennock as Cyrus Longworth and John Yeager.
Yeah.
Not everyone will agree with that. I thought he was
Yeah.
perfect to play this crazy Hyde character. Of course, it
Totally.
has to be Christopher Pennock. From
Yeah.
that group of
Yeah.
actors. Were you and when you had Dr. Jekyll and Penny Dreadful, though, it was a different it was more of a symbolic, he takes on the title of Hyde versus were you going to have him
Right.
transform into Hyde
I was
literally at some point?
yes, I was thinking about that, but it's like the character that I was very, very much wanted to introduce was Dr. Moreau.
Oh yeah,
But
oh, he would have been cool.
the
Yeah.
island of Dr. Moreau wasn't in the public domain. I couldn't
Oh,
get
I
the
see.
rights to it.
Mhm.
So I thought, well, Dr. Jekyll works, and I love it. And the Jack Palance Dr. Jekyll, I
Oh, that was
love.
great. Oh yeah, Dan Curtis,
And then
another Dan Curtis production. So good. Yeah.
and it's weird. I didn't hear that till years later, and I was like, "That's the music from House of Dark Shadows." It's like
Yeah.
hearing the music. The music cue was great. I also think, by the way, just as a complete sidebar, that Jack Palance's Dracula is my favorite Dracula ever.
Oh really? Wow.
Because of how feral he is. So Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde is obviously one of the great myths. It wasn't, as you know, it was an episodic thing, just like Dark Shadows, when Robbie Louis Stevenson wrote it. And it was fun for me to be more overt about literary references, because I could have Dorian Gray as a character, not as a theme. I could have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a character, because they were all available. And that was the whole conceit of the show, which is like, let's take these, great mythic literary characters and put them with a bunch of fictional characters, which is exactly what Dark Shadows do, which I have always acknowledged. That's like Dan Curtis, Art Wallace, Sam Hall, Violet Wells, all the actors, they took great myths of literature, of terror literature, Gothic literature, however you want to find it, and they put them in a modern context. And I said, that's exactly what I want to do with literary figures.
Is there in Dark Shadows, is there any horror archetype or tale that you would have enjoyed seeing them incorporate into the show that they didn't do?
Yeah, without a doubt, The Mummy.
The Mummy, same here.
When I was the Universal movies, the only ones that weirdly actually scared me were the Mummy movies. And I was genuinely terrified. The first one, yes, with the black eyes, but then the 4 Lon Chaney movies, those terrified me.
Karras,
and yes, Karras, yes, exactly. And I think it's one of the best Dan Ross novels.
It is
the one about the Mummy's curse, and so I would have loved to have seen what they would have done with a mummy.
Same. There are rumors that they were going to do that, or that they had proposed the idea and they were going to do it, and then Dan Curtis didn't want to do it. I don't know if there's any truth to that, but it's something I would have enjoyed seeing. And I always reference the story Lot Number 249 by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle too, which they just adapted for the BBC's Ghost Story for Christmas. I haven't watched it yet, but they did an adaptation of that story. It's a short story by Doyle, and I think it would have worked well if they had incorporated that into Dark Shadows with elements of the Karras films and the Karloff. They could have then worked the Karloff film into it as well, which they did with Barnabas too. That's another thing.
Absolutely.
That went into
Barnabas has many Josettes.
Yes, it's Imhotep. Yeah, it's the first Mummy movie for sure. I agree. And I mean, there's I always when the writers in those interviews and Dan Curtis say, "Oh, we just ran out of ideas." No, you didn't. You guys didn't. You could have kept going. They were just burned out, which I get. I mean, and Dan Curtis wanted to go to Hollywood and do. He wanted to do movies, and I get it. And Frid didn't want to do Night of Dark Shadows, so that was a whole to do there. So, unfortunately, it would have been interesting to see what they could have done. What about collectibles? Now you've sent me some pictures of your collection, which I will put up for the YouTube version of this episode. For those who prefer the video version, you can see some pictures of John's collection here. You've been collecting Dark Shadows merchandise for quite a while. So what are some of your favorite collectibles? What were some of the ones you picked up when you were a kid and now?
I have way too many. It's just because some of them are original, some of them from like 50 years ago. Like like the original, the comic books, all of those are original I had. And I moved a lot in my youth, as I told you, so things got lost, things got given away, but I've kept at it. It's like when a box arrives, my husband always says, "Oh, you got another box from Collinsport." I'm like, okay, yes, I know I did. Thank you. And so there's things I really treasure. I have some signed pictures of the cast, which I love to pieces. I have the Barnabas mask, the sort of Halloween mask, which I love. There's a lot that it began in earnest, like when the writers were on strike last year, a righteous strike that we needed to do. But all screenwriters suddenly, I had theater work to work on, but suddenly had all this time. So what I did was I started with episode 1, and I just deep dived into Dark Shadows all the way through. And then when I was on the picket line, I would listen to Catherine Lee Scott's amazing audiobooks too. So it was a very deep dive. And then I started actively collecting real rarities as much as I could, at the beginning of the strike, which thank goodness is over.
Yes. And did you what kind of things did you did you acquire?
I got the models that were already made and painted
Oh,
because
great.
that was never my skill.
Same.
You know,
That's what I buy them pre-made.
yes,
Can't do it.
as much as God knows, I tried with the Aurora models, I tried with Barnabas and Chris Jennings. It was a failure. So those are, because they were sort of the holy grail when I was a kid, and I could never do them. Those are probably my favorites. The
Mhm,
having those like actually done and painted. I don't have Josette's music box,
mhm.
which I know you do, so I'm very
I
jealous
Yes,
of everything you have.
yes,
Yeah,
back there
there
in
it
the
is.
little
Yeah,
little case.
I had actually a few things made,
Oh,
like images that I loved, from like the press kit and things like that that were never released. It brings me so much joy. It just brings me joy. It gives me joy to walk into my room and look at the stuff and rearrange it and like, oh, I'm going to put the cards, all the trading cards here now, and I'm going to put them in different boxes with different cards in front. It's like in a very hectic world, which we
yeah,
live in right now, and I'm very busy with my work. It's nice to have not only a place I can sit and revisit something that was so important to me as a piece of television or a piece of cinema, but also go to a place where I can touch a bit of myself 50 years ago and
yeah,
saying, 50 years ago, you took your bike down Mantis Avenue to the 7-Eleven and you bought this because it was important to you and you didn't have any money, but it was important enough for you to buy and it was important enough for you to save for 50 years. And that's important to me to remember that kid who
yeah,
fell in love with what imagination can be. And that's the great lesson of Dark Shadows is it is an imaginative world.
yeah.
Anything is possible. Parallel time is possible. Time is fungible. You can come back from the dead. You could dance with Carolyn the Blue Whale. You can flirt with Quentin. Anything is possible in that world, and that's so it makes my heart soar.
I love that Dark Shadows is kind of your go-to. Like can go into that bubble to kind of get away
Yeah,
from everything
yeah.
and
And
do
I
that.
wish I wish our bubble were bigger.
Mhm.
I wish it got more respect. I
Yeah,
wish that more people shared our passion for something that deserves passion and was made with passion. But it is very much a safe place for me for sure.
yeah. Oh my God. I mean, it's just when I see people raving about the Anne Rice novels or Buffy the Vampire Slayer or whatever. I'm like, those things wouldn't exist if it weren't for Dark Shadows. Anne Rice was a
Yeah,
huge Dark Shadows fan. I mean, it's
yeah,
obvious and she's used to openly talk about it. Stephen King was a
yeah,
Dark Shadows fan. I mean, these
yeah.
things are and it had such an impact, I think, that it just doesn't get the credit that it deserves. And it would frustrate me when I went to I mentioned this on the podcast before. I went to San Diego Comic-Con. It was 2016. It was the 50th anniversary of Dark Shadows, Batman 66, and Star Trek. And I guess the monkeys too. I didn't see any monkeys stuff at San Diego, but I saw lots of Batman, lots of Star Trek, no Dark Shadows, except I think there was Hermes Press did a panel. Hermes Press did do a panel for their comic collections that they were putting out at the time. But it's just frustrating. Like I'd like to see more of a presence in pop culture. What is the key there? Like why and how can Dark Shadows
Yeah. Well,
be?
it needs its next generation. It needs Star
Yeah,
Trek the next generation. And
yeah, yeah,
if it's not Mark B. Perry, it's going to be someone
mm,
is going to care enough to like introduce that
yeah,
to the world in a way that is modern and fresh and will be exciting. And once you open that door to that world and say, well, I didn't create this. You know what? And the Twilight movies didn't create this, and Anne
yeah,
Rice didn't create this, and Stephen King didn't create this. Dark Shadows created this. So go back and look.
yeah.
Respect must be paid, as Arthur Miller said.
Yes.
Respect must be paid.
Yeah. I mean, it's what happened with Doctor Who, right? When
Yeah.
the new Doctor Who, people went back to look at the original
Yeah.
Doctor Who episodes, which are not a far cry from
Yeah.
Dark Shadows, those early Doctor
No.
Who episodes. So certainly, and another thing too is when I had Will McKinley on the podcast, he did point out that things Star Trek and Batman have huge corporations backing
Yeah.
them to put them out there. And Dark Shadows is Dan Curtis's daughters. They own
Yeah.
Dark Shadows. So that's it's not it's
Yeah,
I mean
but with the right corporate support, which is possible,
mhm,
with a new series or some new idea behind it, and Warner saying, okay, we'll spend the money. Let's make this a film. Let's make this a release. Let's do something with this. I live in perpetual hope because I couldn't face the blank computer screen every day if I didn't. And my perpetual hope for Dark Shadows is that event will occur, and there will be some flash of lightning that will make people just stop and look for a second and give it a chance,
Yeah.
and give it a chance in the right way. Give it a chance in the right way, not as camp, which drives me insane.
Yeah.
Because
Same.
there's never been a more earnest television show than Dark Shadows, ever. It is not camp. It's the diametric opposite of camp. But I believe there's a way. I have to believe that's going to happen.
Being in the industry, working in film and television, do you run into people who are Dark Shadows fans?
Yeah, of course I do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, they tend to be older,
Mhm.
and they tend to have an awareness of the genre and the art
Mhm.
form.
Yeah.
But they see my phone or my wallet. It's a Dark Shadows, but people will comment on it in a great way.
Yeah.
Sometimes I leave my wallet sort of sitting out on a table, and I hope people will notice it. I hope someone will say, "Oh,
Yeah.
it's Dark Shadows, Barnabas Collins. I watched
Yeah.
that. My mother watched that. I saw that movie or something, or I read those comic books." So people do, and sometimes in very surprising ways that you wouldn't expect. This person loves Dark Shadows. Okay, let's talk. Let's talk
Yeah.
storylines.
Yeah.
Let's talk Count Patofi.
Yeah. Or I mean, your original love of monsters and Shakespeare, Jonathan Frid,
Yes.
combine those. He was
Exactly
that.
right. Exactly right. I mean, one of the reasons, obviously, when I was a kid, I wanted to be Barnabas Collins. Looking back on it, other characters emerged to me as being particularly thrilling or exciting or moving in some way.
Mhm.
But yes, for me, it was the combination of the gravitas, the way he used language, as a Shakespearean actor, with, oh, and you're a bloodthirsty, torn vampire. Okay, it was again. Did they make this show for me? It feels like that sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, great. All right, John. Well, is there anything else you want to touch on that we haven't covered before we...
Well, I just want to say, how much I admire what you're doing,
Oh, thank
because
you.
it's people like you that keep a very important flame alive, and we have to keep it alive because it's meaningful. It's meaningful to art, and it's meaningful to life if you let it be, and what you do so enthusiastically with so much benevolence, through your podcast, through Shilling Shockers, it is so loving and welcoming to everyone about what they think about Dark Shadows. You can be queer, you can be straight, you can be any race, you can hate this storyline, you can love that character. It's all accepted in the world that you've created. So hats off to you is what I say.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
I love hearing different perspectives. It's
Mm.
I like hearing how people see Dark Shadows through their own lens and what they love about it, or not love about it. And it's fun to listen to. But one unifying theme, which you called out, one thing that a lot of fans have in common is that sort of feeling other and connecting with the show. People who feel different and connect with the show in
Yeah.
that way.
And
Yeah.
and thus the moral imperative of the show that we spoke about.
Mhm.
You feel different, you feel other, you feel like Adam. What are you going to do? What
Yeah.
are you going to do? Are you going to be vengeful? Are you going to be forgiving? Are you going to
Yeah.
be wicked? Are you going to be good?
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah Collins, and
Yeah.
thank you, Barnabas Collins, for living that story for us, so we could experience so many variations of it. Because art is about morality. It's supposed to be lessons to live by in some way, or to reject in some way. And that was so compellingly presented, in Dark Shadows, I think.
I just want to remind people about Double Feature, and keep your eyes out for that, because if you're in London, definitely please go see it because it sounds amazing. And if it comes here to the States, I'm sure I will make my way to hopefully to New York or Boston, and to go see that. And is there anything else you'd like to tell us about that's coming up outside of Double Feature?
Well, there's a couple, 5 days ago, a movie that I've been working on for 7 years started filming, and it's called Michael. It's about the life story of Michael Jackson. And it's a very complex, big movie, and that comes out, I believe, April of next year. So hang on, go see Michael. And I wrote a musical with the Aviator brothers called Swept Away that was at the Arena Stage, and hopefully we'll be going to New York sometime this season, knock wood. So keep an eye out for those, maybe.
Oh, wonderful. Fantastic. Well, John, I want to thank you again for visiting with me and taking time out of your very busy schedule to talk about Dark Shadows with me. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been great chatting with you over email too. And yeah, hopefully we can have you back sometime to.
When you do the entire episode about Count Patoffy's unicorn, please call me, because that's my particular obsession.
Yes, yeah. We need to have the backstory of Count Patoffy and
We
and
do,
we
desperately.
we need to see this. Um, that's such a weird thing too. I mean, we could just keep going because it's so wild that they threw that into. I'm like, this is something
Yeah.
out of a dark fairy tale or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's like, again, you're sitting there as a kid, you're like, what did he just say? And suddenly a whole new door is opened up about that character. It's
A gift
gorgeous.
from
It's
the
gorgeous.
unicorn.
Yes, it's a gorgeous it's a gorgeous idea and a gorgeous piece of performance.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, wonderful. Thank you again, John. And folks, thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any episodes. And if you have friends who love Dark Shadows or all things spooky, please spread the word, spread it like the dream curse. Let them know about Terror at Collinwood, and we'll see you next time.
So I'm just cutting in here after the fact. I've used Quentin's Stairway Through Time, and I'm now in the future. And I've given this some thought, what we're talking about here. And I always say, I want to live in the TV show Collinwood. The movie Collinwood, I'm a little scared to live there. The TV show one, I'm kind of drawn into it. But then I thought about it a little more. It's such a wonderful escape, such a fantastical place. You want to be there. But if you really think about it, it's a really dangerous place to live. I mean, you want to live in Collinsport? This might be a good episode topic. Maybe I'll interview a bunch of fans and really think about this. Do you really want to live in Collinwood? Let's really give this some thought. It is a great escape. It's a world that pulls you in, right? You want to inhabit that world, live in Collinwood, go to the Blue Whale. But, the chances that you will survive that world are limited. You probably will be killed, if not by a supernatural being, then probably by a vengeful psychopath, or as a byproduct of somebody trying to frame someone else, but probably by a werewolf who tears you to shreds, or a vampire. And I mean, yeah, it's cool. Dark Shadows has ghosts and vampires and werewolves and witches and zombies. And it's cool until they come for you. So are you, I guess if you went in with like Professor Stokes level knowledge of the supernatural and came armed for that, okay, you were prepared. But if you're new in town, you just, you went through the parallel times, or you're spending the weekend at Seaview Terrace, you go into the East Wing, you open the door, and parallel time is real, but you end up in Collinwood, real Collinwood. You're new in town. Chances are you're not going to survive. You are doomed. And then you will probably wander the halls of Collinwood as a tormented spirit for the rest of eternity. Hey, that still sounds kind of cool. There's still a pull there, I have to admit. I'm like, that's kind of cool. You'd be a ghost in Collinwood. You can scare other people now. But it's this is getting to weird territory here. What I'm talking about, this is extremely geeky. But do you really want to live in Collinwood or in Collinsport in general? Knee-jerk reaction, yes. But if you think about what will most likely happen to you, the per capita murder rate in Collinsport is probably unnaturally high. You're probably going to be killed by something horrible, or at the very least tormented by something in your life, or some external force that is oppressing you. How many super happy people do you see living in Collinsport? And especially in Collinwood. Ain't nobody happy in Collinwood. So, I'm just saying. Because happy endings and Dark Shadows are few and far between. That said, I think I'd still risk it.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be Terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.